denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. Almost everyone has heard about the 5 stages of grief. Whether you've heard about it from movies, or the internet, or even by word of mouth, you probably are familiar with the stages that everyone goes through during the grieving process. But what if I told you that the 5 stages of grief aren't accurate? That most of the time, they don't apply. First of all, grief, or as it's known technically, bereavement, is a very complex topic that cannot be explained by an oversimplified 5 stage system. According to an excerpt from Omega, Journal of Death and Dying, Volume 74, Issue 4 by Margaret Strobe, Hank Schutt, and Catherine Borner, the 5 stages of grief is dangerous to healthcare and grievers alike because it pushes the idea that bereaved people go through a consistent pattern of grief after the death of a loved one. This is normally not the case, as grief can take many forms, such as going through the stages out of order, going to one stage repeatedly, and even not going through any of the stages whatsoever. Seeing grief as a progression or path that a grieving person must follow in order to move on from loss can be harmful to those who are grieving by giving them false expectations that they will or should go through all of the stages in order. Now, with this new perspective, you may ask if grief is so complex that it cannot be explained by a 5 stage theory, then where did this theory even come from in the first place? Well, the first models relating to the 5 stages of grief was from research conducted by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 1960s. Kubler-Ross observed people as they progressed through the dying process. From the results of her testing, she concluded that there was a common stage progression that takes place during the dying process, before acceptance. She recorded her findings in the book on death and dying, dedicating chapters 3 through 7 to the discussion of each and every stage. The observation process used in the book is criticized by peers in the same field of study. One such example of this criticism refers back to the excerpt from Omega Volume 74. The book on death and dying does not have sufficient evidence with strong results and also lacks explanation about the uncontrolled variables that may have affected the individuals observed. Kubler-Ross, the person who originally described the stages of grief, later stated in her book on grief and grieving that the 5 stages of grief were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages, and that there is not a typical response to loss. So, now that you know the shortcomings of the 5 stages of grief, you may wonder if there's a better model to help track the progression of grief. George Bonanno outlined a model called the trajectory approach, where he accounted for the pre-loss factors that would affect how an individual would react during the grieving process. In the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Volume 83, Issue 5, he acknowledged that the vast majority of research on grief can only happen after the loss, making it difficult to project the trajectory of the grieving process. But in his research, he found that there was 5 core grieving patterns: common grief, chronic depression, improvement during grieving, and resilience. The trajectory of the individual is influenced by what the mindset the individual had before the loss occurred. If they had dependency on the person lost, then they're more likely to have a chronic grief trajectory, while having an acceptance of the person's death before the person dies and a belief in a fair world tends to lead to a resilient trajectory, which is more desired because it doesn't have that high of a strength in emotion. Look, experiencing grief isn't easy for anyone, but I hope that this information has given you a better understanding of grief and its misconceptions, and will allow you to go through the process more smoothly, or help a friend or family member in need during bereavement. The grief process may take a few months or several years to complete, but with the right support and help, you can adapt to loss.